What's going on, everybody? I mean, every single day, every time I turn around, there is a video with a thumbnail that talks about, is the hobby dying? Is it dying? And then it feels like the same people 3 days later have a video that says the hobby's going to the moon. It's taken off. This new sale, this new that. And I just kind of think it's funny. Now, that said, I will say that I think that something we all kind of care about is the health and the foundation of how things are going with sports cards. You know, we want to know, even if it doesn't really matter. I mean, it's just like the economy. Like, even if we've got the same job and we still have to pay our bills and we still have the same expenses, we still want to kind of know, is the economy doing okay, or is it down, or is it up? And paying attention to that is certainly interesting. And it's certainly something that I think is healthy to be aware of. You know, I use this example all the time too. Even though I'm not selling my house, so I'm not planning on buying a house, I still am curious as what's happening with the prices of housing in my area, in my neighborhood. What's going on with that? So I posed the question last week, what do you all think? Do you think that the hobby is dying? Do you think that the hobby is taking off? Do you think that we're in a boom that's only getting started? Is it coming to an end? Where is the status of it all? Because all of us have an opinion, but all of it's anecdotal. We just have our own experiences to draw from. And maybe we've seen some videos and we've heard some other opinions and we've talked to people, or we've gone to some card shows and we've seen people. And yeah, maybe there's some truth to that. But I think that asking people in the community, not just in my region, not just in Sacramento, not just in California, but across the country, what do you all think? What do you all see? What is your feeling? What are you seeing with prices? Because the other thing is, we all collect differently. What I buy, what I'm looking at, what my saved searches are, what my interests are on REA or Golden or eBay is going to be different than others. And so when you come together and you get feedback from everyone and you just kind of brainstorm, it probably gives us a much more accurate idea of what's actually happening instead of just whatever I see through my eyes. I am not all-knowing. That is for sure. I know that for sure. So asking each of you to share your thoughts is interesting. And I'm not surprised that a lot of people who responded said, no, the hobby's not dying. We're all hobby enthusiasts. Even if it was, we'd probably say that we don't think that it is, because we don't want it to be. So I understand that it's probably a bit of a biased thing. And I also understand that I would say 90% of the people who watch my videos are probably people who are predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly vintage collectors. So there's probably a little bit of a bias there as well. And I get all that, and I'm aware of all that. But I still think that your perspectives are interesting, and there were a couple of things that came up in reading these responses that I think that's a really good point and worthy of talking about. So let's get straight into some of your responses. I have them kind of by category, like I like to do, but I have a couple of kind of broader overall responses that I want to start with first. Let's look at those before we get going. I don't think the hobby is dying, but it's definitely leveling itself off. I think we're about to go through a phase where modern cards are going to face a reality check. The high-end stuff will always be desired, but a lot of the shiny stuff is going to go the way of 1989 Donruss. Supply and demand is undefeated. Now, vintage, another reality check, but in a good way. A classic will always be a classic, and well-centered and properly preserved cards from the pre-1980s are going to be honored as they should. On topic, comps on vintage are obsolete. Beautiful cards will win the day, regardless of the grade. My opinion. And my pal Tony, Southern Collector 14, says, great video.
I don't think the hobby is dying at all. The National in Cleveland had every different type of collector there. It had young kids with shiny chrome, autograph hounds, older guys sitting at dollar boxes, auction house museum setups, YouTube get togethers, influencers, big Netflix show guys, big time collectors with millions of dollars in cards in their pockets, and a breaking area that would rival a Las Vegas casino, etc. That is a well rounded hobby environment. People have been saying for years that baseball is dying, but the crowds at MLB parks have never been higher. To improve the hobby, the big card companies need to reevaluate what they are doing for the long term health of the business model. Turning their offerings into big hits or nothing in every pack and box isn't sustainable. The vintage world seems to be operating just fine.
All right, so before we get into some specifics of some commonly themed responses, I thought those two were great places to start. If you think about what we just heard there, what those two just said, number one, there will always be demand, there will always be interest in well-preserved, nice eye appeal copies of vintage cards. I believe there will always be people who want nice looking Mickey Mantle cards and nice looking Babe Ruth cards and nice looking Ty Cobb and Hank Aaron and Willie Mays cards. I think that those types of guys, those iconic players in cards that are nice looking, not distracting, not thrashed, but just nice looking, there will always be some demand for those. And, just like when the stock market crashes, there are some really healthy companies that don't crash nearly as much because there's a lot of, they're just sort of safer and more widely invested in and more widely believed in. And I think that nice looking vintage cards, not necessarily all 9s and 10s and 8s, but nice looking vintage cards that are good looking cards. The really beautiful cards like the 54 Hank Aaron and the 54 Ernie Banks and the 52 Mantle. Those types of cards that are gorgeous cards just on their own in good eye appeal versions will always have demand. And like Tony says, he makes a really, really good point at how well-rounded the National was. Now, granted, the National is, the Super Bowl of sports collecting worldwide. So people come from all over the place to go to that. But it did seem very well attended. It did seem busy throughout the rooms, in not just the vintage rooms or the modern rooms, but equally distributed. The cards that were on display by the auction houses were getting lots of attention. The breaker area was getting lots of attention. The autograph pavilion was getting lots of attention. The grading companies were busy. Everything looked pretty darn healthy. And sure, maybe some local card show that I've been to or you've been to didn't have a lot of foot traffic, but that might not necessarily mean that the hobby is struggling. That said, there are some of us who in their response said, no, the hobby is healthy, but there are segments of the hobby which are in trouble. And I want to take a look at some of those right here.
So some people are saying that parts of the hobby might be dying, but not necessarily the whole thing. This first one says, I hear ya. There's a shop in my city that has the same inventory from when I was 12 years old in the early 1990s. He's still displaying the 88 Donruss Alomar rookie. And we all had 20 of it, I think. I think the mania of the modern hobby might be dying a little, aside from women's basketball cards, which have exploded. I've noticed a slight pullback on vintage, which I like since I want to get more. I don't care about grading as much as I used to. Eye appeal is first for me. A funny thing I notice is ungraded junk wax rookies seem to be getting some traction. Griffey and Frank Thomas in particular. And another comment says, for this week's question, I don't think the hobby is dying. I believe it might hurt ultra-modern flippers, breakers, and collectors, but not vintage collectors because the cards we get are from the second-hand market anyway. But my opinion is, if you think the hobby is dying, you were in it for monetary gains anyways.
Okay, so here we have a couple of responses that point specifically to modern cards. And again, I realize that most of us in Midlife Nation that are watching these videos are probably people who are more into vintage. So it's easier to say, yeah, that stuff over there isn't healthy, but what I'm collecting is just fine. But if you look a little deeper, we are coming off of the biggest boom, maybe the second biggest boom in the history of at least current card collecting, right? The late 80s, early 90s was a massive boom. COVID was a massive boom. I mean, massive boom. And Panini is like broke. Panini is like broke. Topps and Fanatics is like not really, they're not exploding with money. You hear rumors about some issues with Topps and some issues with Fanatics and what's actually going on. It's hard to know what's actually going on. But if we're coming off of, a major, major explosion in the hobby, and they're kind of struggling right now, isn't that a little concerning? Now, who's doing well? The grading companies are absolutely killing it right now. And it seems like eBay's kind of killing it. Now, Beckett's struggling. I think Beckett has made some decisions over the last few years that probably weren't ideal decisions. I think it's salvageable. I think it's correctable. I think the brand name that Dr. Beckett created and the brand recognition and respect for the brand that still exists makes that a salvageable asset for sure. But how are Panini and Fanatics / Topps struggling at all right now? How is that even possible? So I don't think that the hobby as a whole is hurting. I do think that there should be some concerns for modern stuff. My buddy Adam over at Splendid Sports, he did a video the other day and he was talking about, ways to improve the hobby. And you should check that video. I'll put a link of it in the description down below. And he talked about some really good ideas about what they can do to fix modern cards. They're definitely overprinting. And there's definitely so many different brands and lines that it's hard to know what is what. It's hard for a casual collector to step in and collect because they don't even know what everything is. And there's so many parallels, you don't even know which ones are good. And there's so many different numbered parallels. And it's absolutely overkill. And they're absolutely maybe financially benefiting right now, but I think that in the long run they're kind of killing themselves. It's like the person who's buying lots of stuff for their house right now on credit cards. It's like, yeah, right now it looks like you're doing great, but you are about to hit a brick wall and it's coming rapidly because you are creating your own demise. And that's what it seems like the major manufacturers are doing at the moment. Is, to me, they're creating their own demise with the methodology that they're going through. So I tend to agree with this. I tend to think there are problems. I tend to think it's all fixable. It is all fixable. But in order to fix it, I think they're going to have to contract a little bit. And I don't think any of them want to contract. I think all of them only want to grow exponentially. But sometimes what you need to do is focus just what you're really good at. Just be really good at a couple of things. It's like In and Out. You go to In and Out, they don't have a major menu. They don't have 80 things on their menu. They've got like 4 things on their menu, and they're really, really good at those 4 things. I think that the major manufacturers need to get really good at just a few things and get that really dialed in and scale some of this stuff back in the meantime, because I think that it's sort of like the Cold War, and they're bankrupting each other and they're bankrupting themselves.
Another kind of common response that I got was not that the hobby is dying, it's just that the hobby is changing. This first one says, "Great video, Greg, as always. In my opinion, I don't think the hobby is dying. What I honestly think is that it may seem like it's dying in some regions, but it's actually increasing in others. The card shows that I have been to, the turnout is based on the promotional end of the venue. If you don't promote, people don't come. It's like the Field of Dreams quote, if you build it, they will come. It's actually, in my opinion, have grown. I have seen families going to these shows near me, all the members buying cards in packs. You see it in videos also, daughters, wives, girlfriends, etc. It's no longer a male-dominated hobby. With the recognition of female sports, that opened a lot of great happenings. I think corporates and fanatics are hurting the hobby more because of the big money value they are placing on up-and-coming players, and today's youth don't research and have fun researching players that they like to collect. They are also being told who to like instead of getting the excitement of researching players and deciding who is their big hit. My idea to make it better is to start taking away power from the dealer and giving more education to the collector. Teach the youth primarily, research players and let them choose like we did back in the day. Today, the world pushes on youth what to think and not how to think. The promotions of card shows also should be tried to get their message out soon and on many media platforms." And my friend Don says, "Greg, for this week's question, is the hobby dying and what can we do to make it better?" No, the answer is the hobby is not dying. The fact that people even are worried about it is laughable. It is simply changing. As long as I've been around, I see similarities to the past. Remember the junk wax era? People said the same thing then. Overflooding the market back then only created a bunch of low-priced cards that to this day you only need one set of for your run. There were company buyouts and consolidations back then too, just like the talks going on with fanatics now. If I was going to worry about the hobby dying, it would be if something happened to the Hall of Fames in major sports. Regardless of what the card companies do, vintage is steadily there. Grading companies seem to be doing well in the down economy. I see many people younger than me in the hobby. So what can we do to make it better? Let's start by talking about the promoting lower tiers Hall of Famers. I hate to use that term. Maybe forgotten Hall of Famers is better. Try to get a buzz going around them. A lot of people love this hobby, love history in general. Another thing, this hobby was really started by set builders. It has evolved into player runs. Take your pirate cards, for example. I'm waiting for the day you finish it to see what your feeling of accomplishment will be. Most player run collectors don't experience that, but maybe you see it with your dad building his 50 sets. I have much more to say, but this is already too long. Thanks as always. And a wise man who may or may not be related to me says, "The hobby is not dying, but it's changing. Set building is way down, making commons and minor stars less valuable. The big stars are mainly what people want, it seems. Even some of the second-tier stars are going down. Older and older cards of premier stars, in my honest opinion, are still going strong."
Oh, man. Now, sometimes what we've got to do, if you want to know what's really happening, is you need to reach out and hear from the people that have actually been around for a while and actually seen it and seen how things have evolved. And there are a few collectors that I respect more than my dad's collection and the way he collects and what he's learned along the way over decades of collecting. And same with my buddy Don, who's an incredible collector, but specifically football card collector. And they basically said the same thing. And so all of us, young guns who think we have all the answers, sometimes you just got to sit down next to the guy who's been around for a while, the wise old owl, and go, what's actually happening here? And ask them. And those two responding with virtually the same response, I think is extremely telling. And what they both said was, no, the hobby is not dying. But the hobby has absolutely changed. The hobby was really built over years and years and years on set collecting. It was all about completing a set. It was about organizing your set. It was about filling in the empty slots in your 9, card pages. It was about laying out the cards and putting them in the piles and putting them in the 500 count boxes. That's what the hobby was built on, is set collecting. But by the modern manufacturers essentially making base cards completely worthless. What that has done, what that has trickled down on, is instead of collecting to collect the players and the players that you like and the players that you watch and the players that you root for, it's about the few rare hits. And that does seem like it's trickled down in the hobby. And it is no longer a hobby built on set collecting. Are there set collectors? Of course, there are some set collectors. But when my dad, 30 years ago, when my dad would go to card shows and he was building, just say, his 59 Topps set, you would find a really nice common, and it was $5. 30 years ago. You can find a really nice common now for $2 or $3. So in the last 30 years, where inflation has been rampant, the value of the dollar has gone down, the adjusted for inflation dollar is way different than it was then. It is fewer dollars now than 30 years ago. And it's not just the commons, it's some of like these minor stars too. And when I say minor stars, it's not even guys that weren't great. We're talking Hall of Fame guys. The fact that you could go in and buy a Jim Bunning rookie card for under $50, a Jim Cott rookie card for under $50. I mean, you could go on and on and on with the list from the late 50s through the 60s of really good players, Hall of Fame players, cards that looked nice in 4s, 5s for under $50 is kind of crazy. It's kind of crazy how we've moved not just away from commons, but also away from the really good players, the really good contributors to the teams, the Bobby Mercers and the Bobby Richardsons and the, Elston Howards and all of these Tony Kubeks, and I'm listing a bunch of Yankees I know, but what those guys used to be like fan favorites. And now those guys' cards are really, really cheap. And people don't just want the stars, they want to put the star run together. I mean, that was not a thing. Now, granted, I was a Roger Clemens guy, so I would go to card shows and I'd go through the boxes with the dividers. I'd go to the Clemens section. If there were any Clemens cards I didn't have, I'd add it. But now with vintage, it was like, I'm going to collect all of the Willie Mays cards. I'm going to collect all of the Hank Aaron cards, all of the Mickey Mantle cards. I'm going to do that full run. And that collecting, that set, and how did that happen? Was that the set registry that did that? I mean, my dad always liked Mickey Mantle, and he always liked Mickey Mantle cards, but he kind of focused on the Mickey Mantles in the sets that he collected. He didn't go, I want every Mickey Mantle card, even though he's a huge Mickey Mantle fan. Now, people don't care about the sets. They don't care about the minor stars. They don't care about any of that. They only care about the mega stars, and they only care about the run of that particular megastar player from year to year to year. And Don mentioned that same exact thing. You know, he said, I don't want to call them, borderline Hall of Famers or minor stars, but let's call them forgotten Hall of Famers. Like great players, Hall of Fame players that are literally a dime a dozen now. They're so cheap. Why did that happen? How did that happen? I don't know. But let's see what else you all had to say.
Several people mentioned some things about areas of improvement for the hobby that I really wanted to focus on as well. And this first comment, it's a little bit of a longer comment, but the second part of it focuses on the improvement part, and that's where I want to focus. So let's take a look right there. He says, for the second part of the question, my answer is we need to focus less on highlighting the importance of condition with vintage cards. My comment applies to both grade and eye appeal. Now, there is nothing wrong with choosing to be a high-end collector or having personal standards for a card. My issue is that, as a community, we often spend more time discussing what we are looking for in a card than we do emphasizing just how cool it is to own a piece of history. For me, I think something that I initially found intimidating coming into the vintage community a few years back was all the discussion about grade, condition of people's collections. Now, as time has gone on, I really embrace the idea of collecting what I like. And for me, I love having a whole lot of very iconic, rare vintage cards that are graded between 1 and 4. That said, I think we need to really highlight, for newer collectors, the point that just owning a card you love is awesome. We can still talk about condition and grade because it's a big part of the hobby, but I think we could do a bit better at reminding people that owning awesome cards is fun, regardless of condition. Here's another great and really well-written comment, but I again want to focus on the areas of improvement that he points out. What he says is, what needs to be done to improve the hobby is to encourage collectors to find a focus or many focuses and truly have a PC. I cannot fathom buying a huge case and bringing my whole collection to shows with any card in there available to trade. If you do not have cards that you're attached to, then you will easily be turned off by many things that happen in the hobby. Unscrupulous people, fads where cards plummet in value, and not stick around. And finally, this comment is, I think the problem with the hobby today is how the card companies only make products for flippers and breakers. Topps should be an affordable retail-only set to build from packs. No parallels and very few inserts. Put that stuff in the premium products.
All right. Great comments, great suggestions, great areas for improvement. And one of the themes we saw throughout this video that people mentioned was mentioned here toward the end, which is just love collecting the card. Just having the card is pretty awesome. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be a 10. Why are people caught up on this 10 thing? What is happening with that? Is that a modern thing? Because when you're looking at a vintage card, the fact that a card exists from the T206 set or the T205 set or the 33 Gaudi set, the fact that these cards are 90 to 115 years old and they still exist. They survived World War I, World War II, the Great Depression, Vietnam. They've survived paper drives and people standing in lines at soup kitchens because they couldn't afford to eat. Yet these cards were still preserved, were still held, were still maintained, is amazing. And their existence in itself is incredible. And so it's so wild to me that some people still look down on low-grade stuff. When we're talking about pre-war cards especially, but even cards in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, low grade is still special. There's still something there. It still exists. It still has a story. And sometimes the condition tells the story. And I think part of what happens at times is we all wanna consider ourselves to be a true collector, whatever the heck that means. We want to, no. Everyone else, they're investing, but I collect for the love of the hobby. I love the cards and I collect because I actually love the card. These other people that are obsessed with grades, they don't actually love, they're actually really investing. They're actually really not as focused on the ownership and the joy of owning it. And you know, I got a lot of friends in the hobby at this point, and a lot of them make videos. And some of these people, they are so thrilled with just the pure ownership of the card, and they'll trade down. You know, they'll trade from a 7 away so they can buy a 4 of the same card, and then have money to spend on other cards too. And then there are other people who are trading up, who are saying, this 3 is not good enough, I want a 6. And I don't think one of those things is right and one of those things is wrong. I think that's okay. And when I say a 3 and I say a 6 or I say a 4 or a 2, we're just talking the ballpark of the condition, not the number on the top of the slab. And so I do think that all of us, whether we want to admit it or not, no matter how big of a collector you are, you still probably care some about the values and the potential values of the cards. And then there are some people who care a lot about the values and the potential values, and they look at cards as an asset and they like collecting it, but it's more of a asset that they're collecting than collecting just the card itself. And again, none of that's wrong. So here's my question for this week. I think a lot of people like to say the phrase, collect the card, not the grade. A lot of people say that. A lot of people say it. But I don't think a lot of people do it. You know, the other day I did a video of pickups from the 1960s, and there were a couple of commons that were in 10s, PSA 10s, that sold for thousands of dollars. Cards from the 1960s in PSA 10s that sold for thousands of dollars. And I'm not even saying that they weren't good players, but the only reason those cards sold for thousands and thousands of dollars is because they had the 10 holder. And I'm planning on later in the week looking into this a little bit more and talking about this a little bit more in a video on this topic itself. But that person isn't buying that card for the card. That person is absolutely buying the grade. When there's a Mickey Mantle, a 68 Mantle in a 9, and there's another 68 Mantle in a 7, and side by side you can hardly tell the difference, but the 9 sells for 4, 5, 6, 7 times more. That person is 100% buying the grade, not the card. So here's my question for all of you. I want us all to take a really long look in the mirror and be honest with ourselves. Are you collecting? Are you truly collecting the card and not the grade? Or are you collecting some grade, some card, or all grade, no card? But also, not just what are you doing, but what do you think the average collector is doing? So, are you collecting the card and not the grade? And is the card collecting community truly collecting the card or the grade? I look forward to talking about that next week. There's not a right answer. If you collect the grade instead of the card, I don't think less of you. I really don't. If you collect the card and not the grade, I don't think less of you. I don't think one is smart and one is dumb, personally. I think it's just different. I'm just curious, what are you doing and what do you feel like the rest of the community is doing? I look forward to hearing that next week.